Hello, welcome back to my channel. I hope you all are doing well. It's been a while. I've been very busy with school and work and trying to juggle that, but I'm happy to be back and to be giving this video to you. Happy Halloween or happy fall season. I have my wine glass with lovely Sam from Trick or Treat, my favorite. Anyways, I make true crime content occasionally when I get the chance to, so if that's something that you're interested in, I would love it if you would please consider liking and subscribing to my channel. I'm going to be talking about the Brookfield possession and the true story behind the Conjuring 3 today, so let's get into it. The third installment of the horror movie franchise The Conjuring was released theatrically in the past few months. The movie follows a somewhat fictionalized version of a real murder and demonic possession case that happened in the 1980s, where the perpetrator tried to enter a plea of not guilty by virtue of possession. The case also involves famous clairvoyant Lorraine Warren and her demonologist husband Ed Warren. The case itself is highly controversial and actually split the family in two essentially, so they don't really talk or they don't really get along because of what happened. So I'm going to try to keep the case as unbiased on my own part as possible so you can come to your own conclusions. I'm going to start the video by giving a brief explanation of who Ed and Lorraine Warren were. For those of you who don't know, although I think most people watching this video probably do know as they're pretty infamous, Edward Ed Warren Miney was born on December 5th, 1926, and Lorraine Rita Warren was born on January 31st, 1927. They met and married in 1945 and went on to have one child together who they named Judy Warren. The couple claimed to be paranormal investigators. Lorraine said that she possessed the innate skill of being a clairvoyant and a light trance medium, which is a medium that receives messages from spirit through their mind in a conscious trance-like state. So it's kind of what you see in movies when a psychic is kind of overcome by like a spirit or a voice and they start talking for the spirit. Whereas Ed has no natural skills or capabilities like his wife. Instead, he studied demonology. Well, he was self-taught, meaning he basically just knew a lot about the study of demons. The couple became famous and started gaining more traction and more of an audience, specifically throughout the 70s and 80s, for helping families address and get rid of supernatural hauntings or paranormal happenings that were happening in their home. The most famous case that the Warrens were involved in that the public is probably aware of is the Amityville haunting, which has like dozens upon dozens of movies made about it. But today we're not going to be focusing on that case. We're going to be focusing on a little bit lesser known case called the Brookfield possession and the alleged murder that happened because of it. This all occurred between just 1 year, 1980 and 1981. A lot of the information that I got about the family and about the possession/haunting was from a book that was published and released in 1983 by Gerald Brittle called The Devil in Connecticut. There is also a lot of controversy around the publication of this book by a few of its subjects, including David, who was the one that was quote-unquote possessed. So I wish I had sort of more sources to draw on from about the family and about their personal experiences, but alas, most of this info is from The Devil in Connecticut. The Brookfield possession case involves mainly two families that are both from Connecticut, the Glatzels and the Johnson. The Glatzel family is comprised of 6 members. I believe all are still alive. The patriarch and matriarch might have passed on. I'm not sure though. I think Judy's alive. Anyways, so the parents are Carl Sr. and Judy Glatzel. The couple married around 1953 and then went on to have 4 children together, 1 daughter and 3 sons. From oldest to youngest, their children are using their ages from 1980. Their children were or are Debbie, who was 26 at the time, Carl Jr., who was 14, Alan, who was 13, and David, who was the youngest, who was only 11 years old. At this time in 1980, Carl Sr. was 46 years old and Judy was 44. Throughout the children's children's childhood, Carl Sr. worked as a specialty mechanic on heavy-duty construction machinery, and Judy was primarily a stay-at-home mom. In 1969, the Glatzel family moved from Norwalk, Connecticut to Brookfield, Connecticut, where they lived in a one-story ranch house. The Glatzel family weren't necessarily rich. I believe they were working class, so they kind of did have their financial struggles, and that sort of contributed to a lot of problems that they faced. The eldest Glatzel child, as I said, was Debbie, who was in her mid-20s in 1980, was briefly married in her late teen years, though the marriage didn't last for unspecified reasons. I couldn't find why they divorced, though she did have a son with her first husband named Jason. In 1980, Debbie's son Jason was only 7 years old, meaning she had him when she was around 19. As an adult and a single mom, Debbie worked as a professional dog groomer at a kennel located in Newtown, Connecticut. She had moved out of her parents' house more than 4 years prior, so when she was in her early 20s in 1976, and into a house with the Johnson family where she was their boarder. I saw reports that Debbie first met Arnie, who is one of the main characters in this case, not main characters, one of the main people in this case. She first met him when he was 12 and she was like 19 or something, or 20, and they started a romance like a few years after that, so that's a little iffy, but it was the 80s. I think it's a little bit, the conventions were a little bit different, but just putting that out there. The Johnson family was comprised of 5 main members. There was the single mother, the matriarch, Mary Johnson, and she had 4 kids who she was raising on a single income on her own. She had 3 daughters and 1 son. Mary's eldest child was 18-year-old Arnie Cheyenne Johnson, who was born in January 1962, and as I said, he will become one of the major players in this case. As spoiler, he was the one that perpetrated the murder. Since Mary was a single mother, Arnie reportedly dropped out of high school in 10th grade, so when he was around 15 or 16 years old, to help support his family and work. Mary's primary job that she worked for income while her kids were growing up was as a maid at a local Holiday Inn. She walked to work most days until she was able to buy a car with financial help from Arnie, who had saved up a couple $100 from working as a paperboy, and then gave it to his mother, allegedly. During her time living with the Johnson family, Debbie started dating Arnie when he was a minor and she was in her 20s, and they had plans to get married in the fall of 1980, but before they wed, the young couple wanted to move out of Bridgeport, where they lived with his mother and sisters, due to it being a long commute for Debbie and having an allegedly high crime rate at the time. Arnie also wanted his sisters and his mother to move out with them, so they began a hunt for a new house in early 1980. Sometime in April 1980, the couple found a listing for a house to rent in Newtown, Connecticut, which was the same town that Debbie was working in that time. She was working at a kennel in Newtown, and they saw it in a publication, or it had been published, the ad for the house in a newspaper. After visiting the house, they fell in love with it, and they made verbal plans with the house's owner to start renting the house in early July 1980 for $550 per month, which included utilities. At this time, sadly, Arnie's mother, Mary Johnson, had been diagnosed with colon cancer in 1972, so she had almost been living with the disease for a decade. This happened after she narrowly survived a thyroid condition, so the brunt of the financial responsibility for the Johnson family was placed on Arnie and Debbie, especially when it had to do with the rent that was going towards this new rental house. Thus, they decided that they did want Mary and Arnie's 3 sisters to move in with them in their new rental house in Newtown. Though I would think that Mary would be receiving some sort of disability money because she was physically unable to work, but again, I don't know how the American health system works, or particularly how it worked in the 1980s, so I can't 100% verify if there was any income coming in at all from Mary. I think there would be, though. So there were two parts of the rental house. There was the main house where they planned for Mary to live with the three Johnson sisters, and then an attached apartment that was around the size of a one-car garage, which is where they were planning for Arnie, Debbie, and Debbie's son to live and stay in. At the time, as I said, Debbie was still working at the kennel, while Arnie also got a job working there part-time and was doing side landscaping jobs, though he was set to start a new job as a tree surgeon in August 1980. Debbie, Arnie, Mary, and their respective children and Debbie/Arnie's shared dog went on to move into their new rental home in Newtown on July 2nd, but alleged that they immediately encountered a problem upon moving in. The landlord's daughter had actually been previously staying in the attached apartment in the rental home, but she was supposed to move out before the move-in date on July 1st, according to the landlord's promises. I'm unsure if this was like a verbal or a written agreement, but on the day they came to move in, which was July 2nd, she was still living in the attached apartment, so Debbie, Arnie, and Jason couldn't move in there. She allegedly told them that she was now planning to stay in the attached apartment for an additional 2 weeks, like till around mid-July, because of unspecified health reasons. They also noticed that the house wasn't in as good condition as they thought and would need a lot of repairs over time. According to familial accounts, Debbie's mom, Judy, came to visit the new house or the new rental house the next day on July 3rd, and she brought Debbie's other siblings with her. This day is when some of the family members alleged that the supernatural occurrences began. Since there is multiple sides to this story, I'm going to initially lay out the alleged happenings that are supported and backed up by the Warrens, Debbie, Arnie, and Judy, and the ones that are detailed in the book, The Devil in Connecticut. Then I will present the sort of alternative view that has less public detail about it, unfortunately, because it is less salacious and more sad, and also those family members that are on that side are more private and haven't released a lot about their personal stories because they don't necessarily want it published and they never wanted it to be shared or to be like an international phenomenon. From there, of course, you can decide which side you lean towards, which one you want to believe. I'm not really here to make an argument for or against the existence of ghosts or supernatural entities. That's all up to you. I'm just here to tell you the story as it's available online, and you can conclude whatever you want. Though my bias, which I have to be honest, I'm more prone to believe who I view as the victims in this case, who are, in my opinion, Carl Jr. and David, and I'll explain that more later. So back to July 3rd, 1980. When Judy came to visit Debbie in her new home, she brought 11-year-old David, 13-year-old Alan, and 15-year-old Carl Jr., which were Debbie's three younger brothers. They explored the home and fell upon a room that had a huge waterbed left in it from the previous tenants. It is alleged that when David, though this story is not backed up by David, when he got older, he completely denies all this. So it's alleged in the book that when David was left alone in the room with the waterbed, he felt something push him onto the bed. Then when he turned around to see who pushed him, he saw a ghost. He would later go on to recall to his family, allegedly, that the ghost looked like an old man wearing regular civilian clothing. The ghost then started pointing at David himself and said, "Beware," a couple times, and then disappeared. After experiencing this supernatural occurrence, David allegedly became visibly distraught and wanted to immediately leave the rental house, and I believe he did exit and waited for his other family members who were still talking to Debbie and looking around and stuff. When the Glatzel family eventually returned home, David allegedly told some of his family members about what happened to him in the room with the waterbed, adding that he was still having these sort of vision-like experiences where he could reportedly see what was happening in the rental home, even though he wasn't physically there. He also allegedly told some of his family members that he could see, hear, and communicate with the ghost/specter that he had made contact with in the waterbed room, though its appearance had now changed into something more more malevolent. So his appearance was more demon-like. He had a red body, white face, black eyes, and horns coming out of his forehead. So like costume version of the devil, essentially. Due to other supernatural occurrences, Arnie and Debbie decided to move out of their rental home because they were afraid and stay with Debbie's mother or stay at the Glatzel home temporarily. The couple did try to convince Mary Johnson and Arnie's 3 sisters to move out with them, but Mary refused to move out, stating that she had sunk all her money into the home and she wasn't going to leave it. This eventually created a significant rift between Mary and Debbie/Arnie for a little while. Due to David's experience with the waterbed, Debbie and Arnie tracked down the previous tenants who had left the waterbed and got them to actually take it with them and remove it. When they eventually got in contact with the previous tenants, though, Debbie and Arnie alleged that the previous tenants also claimed that they too experienced supernatural happenings in that home, specifically in the room with the waterbed. The supernatural happenings that this previous tenant allegedly experienced included hearing a voice call their names and hearing chickens clucking when there was no chickens nearby. These supernatural happenings would usually occur around 3 a.m. or the witching hour. The tenant also claimed that they would occasionally hear footsteps up in the attic, see lights turn on and off without real reason or without someone doing it, and doors opening and closing, so think poltergeist. The previous tenant then allegedly actually told Debbie and Arnie that they had discovered that witchcraft had been previously practiced in that house. How the previous tenant would know this or come to that conclusion, I'm not sure. Nothing is really ever explained in the book, which is annoying because I want to give as much detail as possible and I want to give as much sort of verifiable proof as possible, but alas. But the tenant also said that there was an altar, which is like commonly used in witchcraft or occult practices, in a locked storage room in the basement of the rental home. Just want to clarify that practicing witchcraft and that stuff is not necessarily evil like it's framed in the book in this case. Anyways, the person then claimed that the rental home was haunted by an evil spirit. Again, unsure how they got there. David, who appeared to be the main conduit for the malevolent spirit, told his family that the spirit now had a grudge against the Glatzels for their meddling in its nefarious affairs and would continue to haunt them. The family members, primarily Debbie and Arnie, claimed that they began experiencing supernatural occurrences during this time, such as hearing footsteps in the attic and hearing pounding outside the house. Glatzels claimed again that most of these supernatural happenings occurred around 3 a.m. The witching hour again, which tell you what the witching hour is. It's reportedly when the veil between our world and the next, some like to call that the afterlife, is the weakest and spirits and ghosts like to roam in our world too. Since David was the primary target for this malevolent spirit, he was allegedly experiencing the worst supernatural happenings. The demon/specter, I'll call it the demon from now on, started getting violent towards him when David disobeyed his wishes. According to his mother, Judy, there was one time when he actually told something to her that the demon said or did to him. So the demon then immediately physically started punishing him in front of her, which the physical punishment that she witnessed was reportedly David being, quote, slapped by an invisible force. There were also a lot of Glatzel family members who didn't believe that the supernatural happenings were occurring during this time and still don't believe it. Primarily, it was the patriarch, the Glatzel family patriarch, Carl Sr., and 15-year-old Carl Jr. Even though he didn't believe in it, family members then alleged that Carl Jr. began portraying signs of possession or some sort of episodes of unexplainable aggression. Again, this is highly contentious because Carl Jr. said that his portrayal in the book, The Devil in Connecticut, was not accurate to what actually happened and was actually extremely detrimental to his mental and physical or mental and social well-being at the time. These family members alleged that Carl Jr. started started threatening to physically harm members of his family and saying that David was faking the supernatural happenings. Meanwhile, the physical attacks or assaults from the beast, which is the name that David began calling the demon, the assaults that were happening against David began getting increasingly worse. The violent attacks occurred primarily, of course, at night and involved David being slapped, punched, pushed, and choked by an invisible force. David himself said at the time in the book, that he could see the demon or the beast attacking him in the moment, but his family members that allegedly witnessed it said it just looked like an invisible force, or David was kind of doing it to himself. At this point in time, David started claiming that he was seeing more demons, more than one demons. Originally it was just the beast, now it was more, because he claimed that the original beast was bringing helpers from the demon world to help punish David. With the supernatural occurrences increasing and David now being allegedly harmed or physically harmed by the beast, the Glatzel family, specifically Debbie and Judy, became more motivated to find help for their family. It is at this point that Debbie alleges that she first heard of the Warrens from a co-worker who knew of someone who had enlisted the help of Warrens to get rid of a ghost that was haunting them. Again, this book is unfortunately extremely vague and unspecific about important details, like I'd like to know who this friend was or who this previous person was that the Warrens helped, to sort of verify those claims more and hear their side of the story, but it's impossible to verify because the information is not given to me. But the co-worker apparently didn't have the Warrens' number on hand or any way to contact them, so Judy, who was increasingly desperate to get her son and her family help at this point, turned to her local rectory for help, which was St. Joseph's Church in Brookfield, Connecticut. Judy spoke to Father James Dennis, who she reportedly had known for years prior to this because he had baptized some of her children, including David. She first spoke to him on July 9th about the supernatural happenings that were occurring within her home. Father Dennis reports that when he was first confronted with these allegations, he remained impartial. He was tentative to either disbelieve or believe Judy before he talked to David and sort of the other Glatzel family members, because he didn't know if the problem was indeed supernatural or if it was a psychological issue. But at the original meeting, to sort of satiate Judy and help her for the time being, Father Dennis gave her holy candles to bring into her house because he believed that these might help get rid of the supernatural forces if there were any. He then told her to contact him again if the candles didn't work and the supernatural things kept occurring. I believe Judy tried to use the candles in her home but claimed that they didn't work because the beast returned to the home and began physically assaulting other Glatzel family members besides David. So after the holy candles didn't work, Judy then phoned Father Dennis to update him on what was happening. So he decided to come to the home, and this was on July 11th. So all of this had sort of happened only within a week time span. And this is when Father Dennis first spoke to David, who detailed the recent supernatural events that were happening. Father Dennis, now convinced that these supernatural things were actually occurring within the Glatzel home, he decided to put a protective blessing on David as well as the house itself, and then prayed with the Glatzel family for leaving that same day. After Father Dennis's holy blessing, the Glatzels claimed that nothing supernatural happened for one single night, just one night. Then it started to get worse the following day when David claimed that the beast now had 40 helpers to help torture him. Judy called Father Dennis again to update him, and he determined that he was going to inform the Diocese of Bridgeport to get the Glatzel family more specialized help. But he said that church officials officials would first need to conduct an investigation to verify that supernatural things were occurring before they would help the family, which could reportedly take a few months. So Father Dennis told Judy to contact the Warrens in the meantime. Lorraine states that she knew Father Dennis and Father Dennis knew of her because they had worked on a previous case together, like a similar haunting sort of possession case together, and that was how their relationship started and how Father Dennis knew of them. But anyways, in the book, it also says that the Glatzel's neighbor Pat had the Warrens' number. I have no idea how this person had the number, but it's not specified in the book. But anyways, so Pat contacted them on the Glatzel's behalf on the evening of Sunday, July 13th, 1980. The Warrens told Pat that for legal reasons, someone in the Glatzel family needed to contact them for help, so Judy called them back shortly afterwards. The Warrens, who lived nearby, I believe it was like around half an hour away, told Judy that they would come right away and would bring a doctor with them. That's the narrative set forth by the book that Lorraine actually gave a lot of info to the author of the book for, but in an interview from the sort of mid-1980s, she stated that she was actually contacted by a priest, who is Father Dennis, from St. Joseph's Church, who asked her to help the family. So I'm unsure which narrative is true. Both are set forth by Lorraine, essentially. The Warrens arrived at the Glatzel home shortly before midnight on July 13th, and as they said they would, they brought a doctor with them. The doctor examined David to see if he might have a psychological or a physical ailment plaguing him. I'm also unsure of what type of doctor the Warrens brought and what his specialty was or specialization was. In an interview, in the same interview I mentioned before, Lorraine said that he had a son with a similar cognitive deficiency that David had, so she thought if there was medication that David was taking, it would be similar to the doctor's son, so he would be able to identify if the weird behaviors were happening from the medication. But again, they don't give her his credentials anywhere in the book, so I'm not sure. But after the doctor's examination, which reportedly found nothing wrong with David, the Warrens questioned the Glatzel family about their recent supernatural experiences. Ed and Lorraine decided to start their process by antagonizing the beast to get it to show itself to them. Their antagonization reportedly worked, and the beast identified itself to the Warrens by knocking after they commanded it to. This was apparently enough proof for the Warrens, and they determined that the Glatzels were experiencing a spiritual phenomena. The Warrens believed that David, that 11-year-old David, was displaying signs of a transient possession. Some of these signs and symptoms were that he could see through walls, he could accurately describe things taking place in different locations, and was making accurate future predictions. According to the Warrens, this type of possession occurs after an individual invites an entity into their home, usually through a Ouija board or a seance or from a curse. The Warrens, after doing more interviews with the Glatzel family and getting more of their history, traced back the possession from when Debbie took a course on witchcraft and occult in the early 1970s, because it was an elective that was being offered by her high school, which was Brookfield High School. This topic sparked an interest in Debbie, and she purchased a Ouija board, which she said she used multiple times and claimed that she was successful at contacting multiple different spiritual entities. Debbie eventually discarded the board, but according to the Warrens, this was enough to invite the spirits into her home and life. This book is kind of archaic in a lot of its ethical, moral standpoints, in my opinion, because it also does blame the possession multiple times on things that the Glatzels did that didn't necessarily align with Christianity during that time period, which was much more pervasive and strict. These occurrences or things that the Glatzel family was doing that didn't align with Christianity was that Carl Sr., the father of the Glatzel family, wasn't baptized, David hadn't had his first communion, Carl Jr. hadn't had his confirmation, and Debbie and Arnie were living together outside of marriage. These reasons were were conspicuously left out of the movie, probably because it wouldn't really fly in 2021 if they were blaming a tragedy or a sort of trauma on those things. There are priests that are quoted in the book saying that these factors wouldn't necessarily cause possession, but the book's author, in my opinion, seems to heavily imply it. At this time, after the Warrens' visit, David's behavior was becoming increasingly bizarre. He began allegedly actively attempting to harm and kill his family members and began distorting his body, which I assume means that he was contorting it into unnatural positions, such as when you see in like Exorcist movies, you see them like do a handstand, like do a back arch really weirdly or something. Because of this escalation, the Warrens and Father Dennis mutually decided that David needed to undergo an exorcism as soon as possible. But miraculously, after this determination, the beast stopped bothering David and the Glatzels for 2 weeks, which led them to believe that the possession of David and the haunting of their home was finally over. But it all started up again on the day that Father Dennis left for a trip to Ireland on July 27th, and Judy immediately contacted the Warrens and her local rectory for help once again. This time, 2 new priests, Father Melia and Father Di Giovanni, agreed to take on their case and help the family out. The 2 priests came to the home to interview Judy and observe David, who was allegedly very hostile towards them and tried multiple times to get them to leave, but the priests weren't 100% convinced that there was indeed a demonic possession or haunting happening after the initial meeting. These 2 priests then went on to meet with the Warrens a few days later on July 31st, who were the ones who actually convinced the priests that a possession was indeed happening. The 2 priests and the Warrens returned a few days later when the supernatural happenings were apparently escalating in danger. For instance, the family claimed it caused Arnie to crash his car and was continuing to physically assault and harm David. This time, the 2 new priests claimed to witness the possession firsthand when they saw David being choked by an unknown force and saw him levitating 3 feet above a bed. There are claims that Carl Jr., one of the Glatzel middle children, started becoming increasingly aggressive towards his family in early August, namely his mother Judy and his sister Debbie. There was a lot of contention about the validity of these claims from Carl Jr. himself, which I will get into his side later. But allegedly, according to mainly Debbie, and later on Arnie would confirm this, allegedly Carl Jr. would verbally harass his other family members when they would talk about the possession and try to physically harm them when they would, quote, defend themselves and their viewpoints that David was indeed possessed. The Warrens / the book would later go on to claim that Carl Jr.'s aggression was caused by some of the demons inside the Glatzel home, so he was sort of also being possessed or affected. Back to David, the Warrens determined that he was fully possessed by the devil on August 6, 1980. The book, again, doesn't specify how the Warrens came to this conclusion or what led up to it really, but at this point, the Warrens and 3 priests from the Glatzel's local church recommended an exorcism for David. Judy claimed that she noticed a lot of physical differences in her son after he became, quote, fully possessed, claiming that his facial features became sharper, his eyes turned all black, he spoke in a different tone, and he was extremely violent towards his family. There's not a lot of like photo proof of these physical, quote unquote, physical changes that occurred, so we sort of have to believe the Warrens and the Glatzel family's descriptions or reenactments of it. Retelling, not reenactment. The bishop at the local diocese, which was Bishop Walter Curtis, agreed to an exorcism for David in mid-August 1980 after the Warrens and the Glatzel family both submitted evidence to him, including photos of David under possession and the doctor's evaluation of David that found he had no medical problems. The diocese needed David to first undergo a psychiatric evaluation before 100% confirming the exorcism and following through with it. Judy claimed that the psychiatrist found, quote, nothing wrong with David, but this is also contentious because because later on in life, Carl Jr. and David himself would go on to say that David was suffering from mental illness at this time, which was causing him to have hallucinations and delusions. I'll detail that more later. Bishop Walter Curtis assigned Reverend Francis Vergulac to officially handle the Glatzel case and any future exorcism that would happen within the Glatzel case. The Warrens claimed to already have a pretty close working relationship with Reverend Francis at the time because they had also previously worked with him on another exorcism he had performed. Lorraine would say this about Father Dennis in an interview, but in the book they say this about Reverend Vergulac, so I'm unsure if they had a working relationship with both priests or if it was just one or the other and some lines got crossed. The Warrens and Reverend Francis, which I'm going to call him because Vergulac is too hard for my dumb brain, met up on August 17th to discuss David's possession. Reverend Francis, after seeing the Glatzel family and meeting them firsthand, came to the conclusion that he wanted to perform a less extreme version of an exorcism or a less extreme type of intervention than a full-blown Catholic exorcism. So he determined that he was going to perform a high mass at the Glatzel home on August 20th. From my completely layman understanding of what a high mass is, it's just a more ceremonious and intricate type of Catholic mass. Father Francis, or Reverend Francis, did end up conducting the high mass on that day, which was August 20th, and the Warrens claimed that it resulted in the demons temporarily retreating, but it didn't last because he needed a full exorcism. The Glatzels then claimed that because the high mass didn't work, the following week the supernatural occurrences started up again and David was once again fully possessed. These new supernatural occurrences that were happening included threatening phone calls to anyone who would try to help the Glatzels, Arnie almost dying after an accident at his work as a tree surgeon, and David speaking in a strange language that no one could understand. There was also another violent episode where David, who was allegedly under possession at the time, tried to stab his older brother Alan, who I believe was 13, with a steak knife, but Arnie intercepted and prevented the assault. The demon inside David then allegedly said to Arnie, quote, "I will possess you for that," end quote. And Debbie claimed that Arnie began displaying signs and symptoms of possession the following day. For instance, he would start convulsing, growling, and have slight appearance changes. This sort of initial transference of when Arnie was possessed is also contentious because in other interviews, the Warrens say it happened during an exorcism I will detail shortly, but Debbie in the book says it happened after this assault. So that's also a little confusing. But Arnie's alleged possession that Debbie claimed he was having now was different and less extreme than David's because it was episodic. So he would have these possession episodes, of which they calculated 6 in total, which would only last for a minute or two and then he would be back to his normal self, but during the possession he'd have no memory of it. So with the resurgence of David's possession, the Warrens and Reverend Francis decided to perform an actual full exorcism on David on September 2nd with 3 other priests present to try to help and assist Reverend Francis, which they did get their approval for this exorcism from the local diocese to conduct at the local school chapel in St. Joseph's Church. There are later also claims by the director of the Conjuring 3 that a full exorcism never took place. They were like mini exorcisms, half exorcisms, whatever that means. I don't really know the rites of the Catholic Church that well, even though I grew up Catholic, but they don't teach you exorcisms. The Warrens claimed that David was becoming increasingly aggressive in the days leading up to his first exorcism, and they actually had to tie this poor child to a chair with bed sheets in order to transport him to the church on the actual day of the exorcism. David's first exorcism was completed on September 2nd, 1980 at 2 p.m. in the school chapel in, of course, St. Joseph's Church, which was located in Brookfield, Connecticut. It was performed by Reverend Francis and lasted for only 2 hours. The exorcism, according to Lorraine Warren, was only partially successful unsuccessful. Lorraine claimed that Reverend Francis managed to expel 39 of the demons possessing David, but he was unsuccessful in removing the main possessor, which she had identified by this time as the devil himself. Reverend Francis stopped the exorcism after 2 hours out of fear that he was going to kill David, which it's like extremely disturbing to me that these rites ever brought that poor child anywhere close to death. David's second exorcism, which was meant to expel the final 4 demons that were still possessing him, including the devil himself, occurred on September 8th, 1980 at a convent. So David only had 6 days to recuperate between the exorcisms. This exorcism again only lasted 2 hours but was unsuccessful because when David left the convent, he became possessed again at the Glatzel home the following morning by 12:30 a.m. Reverend Francis and the Warrens on the fly decided to conduct a third exorcism right then and there within the Glatzel home on the early morning of September 9th, so David didn't even have a full day to recover. Ed Warren tried to perform a binding ritual on David, well, more the demon possessing David, which is a ritual that would prevent the demon from possessing somewhere else, from transferring and possessing someone else during an exorcism, but he said he was unsuccessful because the demon was too strong. This exorcism was the longest conducted on David, and it lasted for 4 hours, ending just after 6 a.m. and again brought 11-year-old David Glatzel close to death.
David, in the name of Jesus, Jesus repels you. Leave this child alone. It's on your forehead. Yes, Never, you are not strong, you're weak. You're weak. Why? Jesus loves this boy. This is his child.
Wake him out of it. Drop him up to something.
It was alleged that during the exorcism, when David was close to dying, allegedly, Arnie started screaming at the demon and told the demon to possess him instead, which sort of establishes his defense in the murder that he would perpetrate a few months later. So this is, I believe, when the Warrens stated that Arnie became possessed, even though Debbie stated that it happened earlier. The exorcism was deemed a success finally by Reverend Francis and the Warrens because they did believe that David was no longer possessed at the time, but contrary to their original assertion that this third exorcism was successful, the Warrens said that they contacted the Brookfield police in early October 1980 to warn them about the Glatzel home and the possession/haunting that was happening, stating that there could be potential violence that would happen in the future, foreshadowing what would happen in February 1981. Ed Warren would later actually redact him saying that it was successful and say that this third exorcism was unsuccessful because it actually required a trained exorcism or a trained exorcist to perform a major exorcism for the devil to truly be exorcised, which according to Ed never happened. In the months following the third exorcism, the Glatzel family continued to claim that David and Carl Jr. were both still showing signs of possession. They even alleged that 15 or 16-year-old, I think he was 15-year-old Carl Jr. physically assaulted his other family members, resulting in one of them being sent to the hospital. Of course, Carl would later contest these claims. In November 1980, Debbie Glatzel started a new job at the Brookfield Kennels that was offered to her or had been offered to her by 39-year-old Alan Bono, who had reportedly started managing the business, which was owned by his sister. Along with the job offer, Bono offered Debbie a free apartment, so she moved onto his property alongside Arnie and her young son Jason. Alan Bono is the victim in this case here, and unfortunately little is really known about him. I usually like to sort of focus or make my videos focus on the victims of each case because that's more ethical to me in my opinion, but I can't really do that in this case because there's nothing really available about him. Also, I'm not particularly comfortable with portraying Bono as he was described in the book The Devil in Connecticut, because in my opinion it's heavily biased in favor of Arnie, so it makes Bono look rather bad, like almost evil. And Debbie's accounts are also pretty biased. She's sort of the only other person that really said a lot about Bono to the public. Like, hers would be pretty biased for Arnie because that's her partner, so I'm unsure how trustworthy her accounts are as well, so I'm trying to cut the fluff when I'm talking about it. There is a Washington Post article that was published after the murder in 1981 that has some information about Alan. It stated that Alan moved from Australia, where he had owned a plantation for 17 months, to Connecticut to help his sister manage kennels that she owned. So the murder: on the morning of February 16th, 1981, Arnie Johnson called in sick to his job at Wright Tree Service, claiming that he had a sore throat. Meanwhile, Debbie was feeling fine and went about her normal workday and started working at the kennel, or started her shift at the Brookfield boarding kennels. Arnie's sisters, which were 15-year-old Wanda and 9-year-old Janice, along with his cousin, or their cousin, 9-year-old Mary, were visiting the couple at the time, so they were also present at the kennel, sort of watching Debbie do her job. Arnie eventually joined them, just kept Debbie company. Alan Bono was also allegedly there at the time. He was in the kennel as well. At lunchtime, Debbie, Arnie, the three Johnson girls, and Alan all went to lunch at a local bar that was called the Mug and Munch, and Alan paid for all their meals. Alan, Debbie, and Arnie all each had a little bit to drink. Reportedly, Alan drank the most. There are also multiple claims in the Washington Post article and in the Devil in Connecticut book that Alan was known to be a heavy drinker, but these are mostly from Arnie, or from Debbie and the Johnson family. So again, I don't know how much merit put into that. I'd like to hear what Alan's sister says about that. But the five returned to the kennel afterwards, after eating lunch together, where Arnie started working on and repairing Alan's stereo. Debbie took the three Johnson girls out to pick up pizza. It is unclear to me if they were going to eat the pizza with Bono or they were taking it to eat at Mary Johnson's house. But when the four girls returned, they said that Alan at that point was heavily intoxicated and started becoming aggressive. He was trying to prevent them from leaving and allegedly grabbed 9-year-old Mary by her arm, refusing to let go. Arnie, who at that point had started heading to the car because they were planning to leave, overheard what was happening and returned to the kennel. He told Alan to let go of Mary, and when Alan refused, the two men started fighting. I want to say that Alan was 40 years old at this time and Arnie was 19. Debbie said she tried to break up the fight to no avail, and 15-year-old Wanda was tugging on her brother to try to get him off of Alan, but also that didn't work. According to Wanda's account of events that was published in the Washington Post, Arnie began, quote, growling like an animal, and then he pulled out a 5-inch pocket knife and repeatedly stabbed Alan. The stabbing resulted in 5 stab wounds, 4 deep wounds to the chest and abdomen. One of these wounds extended from the base of his heart to his stomach, and 1 shallow wound to Alan's shoulder. After stabbing Alan, Arnie, reportedly in shock, dropped the knife that he used and just walked into the nearby forest, and no one went after him. Alan then fell to the ground. This marked the first ever murder that ever happened in the history of Brookfield, Connecticut. In Debbie and Arnie's version of events, Arnie became possessed during the fight with Alan, hence the sort of devil made me do it offense that was tied to this case. Debbie also alleged that Arnie had become possessed earlier that day and started to actually physically assault her, though he was brought out of the possession when one of his sisters yelled at him. Arnie would later claim that he blacked out. He was completely blacked out and didn't remember anything from 6 to 8 p.m. on that day, on the day of the murder, which was the time period when the murder happened. After Arnie had walked off into the forest to God knows where, and Alan was lying dying on the floor, Debbie went inside the kennel and phoned her mother to tell her what happened and ask her what to do. One of the two women then ended up calling emergency services, and paramedics came to Alan's aid. He was rushed to a nearby hospital, which was Danbury Hospital, but was unfortunately and sadly pronounced dead shortly afterward because one of the stab wounds had actually punctured his heart. A short while later, Arnie was spotted walking along a road. He had, I believe, Alan's blood on him on this time, and he was immediately detained and taken to the Brookfield police station where he was charged with murder. The book, The Devil in Connecticut, at this point then goes on to claim a bunch of things about how the police investigation was rigged and botched against Arnie, but since I can't find any verifiable information outside of these claims made in the book, I'm not going to include them, but I'm just briefly mentioning them here. So if you're interested in more about that and hearing that side of things, you can read The Devil in Connecticut. The day after Arnie's arrest, allegedly Lorraine Warren told the Brookfield police about the Glatzel possession and claimed that Arnie was possessed when he committed the murder. I don't really think the police sort of bought into this. I think they thought it was more of a gimmick and a get out of jail free card sort of for Arnie. The police involved still claim that they believe it was just quarrel that ended in murder, like a violent fight that ended in death, sort of thing. The same week as his arrest, Arnie was arraigned and his bail was set at $125,000. An Arnie Johnson defense fund was created to try to reach the bail so he could be released, so he could pay it and be released, but the fund reportedly didn't raise anywhere near enough and he remained in jail awaiting his trial. As Arnie awaited his trial, the media went crazy with his Devil Made Me Do It story, a lot of which could probably be attributed and has been attributed to the Warrens, who did their fair share of media interviews and buzzed up a lot of publicity by promising that their agents were in talks for creating books, lectures, and even a movie, which would only go on to happen 4 decades later with The Conjuring 3. They were claiming it was all in the works about the Devil Made Me Do It story. I believe the original movie, not The Conjuring 3, the one that was supposed to be made in the 1980s, was set to be a TV movie, but apparently it never came to fruition because of disagreements within the production, or about the production. Arnie then hired defense lawyer Martin Minnella, who, there is another Minnella in the story, apparently a lot of Italians, but he hired him to represent him in trial, who, Martin is quite the character in his own right. For instance, when talking to a reporter about Arnie's upcoming trial, he said, referring to Alan Bono, quote, "Think about it. What's the guy's name? Bono, right? And what kind of name is Bono? Italian, right? So what does Bono mean in Italian? It means good, and evil likes to destroy good," end quote. Martin Minnella, with support from the Warrens, pursued the defense of not guilty by reason or virtue of possession for Arnie's defense or his case, with Minnella claiming that he was going to fly in specialists and subpoena the priests that were involved in David Glatzel's exorcism if, quote, they didn't cooperate with the defense, end quote. Arnie's trial by jury at the Connecticut Superior Court, which is located in Danbury, Connecticut, began on October 28th, 1981. Martin Minnella, on behalf of Arnie, tried to file the defense of not guilty by reason of demonic possession. The judge presiding over the case, Robert Callahan, immediately rejected the defense, stating that no defense could exist in a court of law due to, quote, lack of evidence, and that it would be irrelative and unscientific to allow related testimony.
That what occurred to this young boy and Arnie Johnson was indeed diabolical possession, but I could understand the judge's feelings too. Mm-hmm. He didn't want to be known as the judge who allowed the Devil Made Me Do It case into his courtroom.
Right. Okay. I guess this is an article that talks about you.
The devil made him do it. And the devil did make him do it.
Oh, yeah, we were
Arnie Johnson was under diabolical possession. He didn't know what happened for at least 2 hours. In that 2 hours, he had killed Alan Bono.
So with that off the table and his original defense completely quashed, Martin Minnella decided to proceed by arguing that Arnie acted in self-defense. After the trial concluded, the jury deliberated for over 15 hours over a 3-day period before finding Arnie Cheyenne Johnson guilty of first-degree manslaughter on November 24th, 1981, and shortly afterwards he was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. As I said before, the Warrens, with permission of some of the Glatzel family, a lot of them were underage at this point and couldn't give informed consent for a book to be published, specifically David and Carl Jr. So the Warrens went forward with getting a book written about the Glatzel possession, which was released in 1983, only 2 years after the murder. The family only reportedly earned a lump sum of $2,000 from the publication of the book. I'm unsure how much the Warrens made off of it. The book was then set to be republished, and I believe it was republished in 2006 by iUniverse, which prompted David Glatzel and Carl Jr. to sue the authors, which were Lorraine Warren and Gerald Brittle, and the book publishers for, quote, violating their right to privacy, libel, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Carl Glatzel Jr., who was 42 in 2006, was the more vocal and standing up out of the two brothers about his stance on, or his version of events. He claimed that the Warrens, quote, demon claim was a hoax designed to bring the Warrens money and fame, end quote. Carl Jr. stated that in 1980, his brother was suffering from a mental illness, which caused him to have hallucinations and delusions, and that the Warrens exploited him because of his condition, and also that the book made he himself, Carl Jr., seem like he committed criminal and violent acts against his family, which he very wholeheartedly claims that he didn't do. He also alleged that after the publication of The Devil in Connecticut, he and David were ostracized by their friends and their classmates. It caused Carl Jr. to drop out of school, and both brothers lost job opportunities because of their reputation. Though at the time of 2006, both brothers were successful in their various work ventures, and I believe they both owned businesses, or at least David owned his own business and was successful. Carl Jr. also said that in an effort to get the Glatzels to agree to the book's publications, Lorraine Warren promised that the book would make them millions of dollars and would get Arnie released from jail, of which it did neither. Both authors of the book, Lorraine and Gerald, defended the book after the lawsuit came out. Lorraine said that 6 priests agreed with her that David was possessed at the time, and Gerald said that he published the book because, quote, the family wanted the story told, unquote, which, like, the two main people in the book, Carl Jr. and David, were too young to consent, and as adults they didn't want the book published. So I don't know how. I think that point is pretty moot. The Glatzel patriarch, Carl Sr., has also come out against the book by denying that he ever told Gerald Brittle that his son was possessed, as it alleges in the book. Meanwhile, Arnie Johnson was released from prison after serving only 5 years of his 10 to 20 year sentence. He went on to marry Debbie after he was released, and the pair had 2 children together. They, along with the Glatzel matriarch Judy, endorse and support the Warren sort of telling of events and have gone on multiple television shows detailing the events and their experiences. The most recent, I believe, aired on Discovery Plus, which was sort of supposed to be released around the time that The Conjuring 3 was released, so you could get like the true story behind the movie. But unfortunately, I couldn't access this because I live in Canada and Discovery Plus isn't available here. Carl Jr. also said that he was working on writing a book about his side of events, and I would love to read it, but he said this around 2007, 2006, and the book still hasn't come out, but I hope if it's something that he wants to do, that he will release it one day and I will buy and read it. So that's really it for this video on the Brookfield possession and the murder of Alan Bono. I know I really did try to keep my biases out of it, but I think I made it kind of clear which stance I'm on. But please feel free to let me know if you believe in the possession, or you do believe that David was possessed, or if you side more with Carl Jr. and David's side of events, that David was just mentally ill and was exploited by the Warrens. I'd love to hear your opinions. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe if you want to. Subscribe and like, and I'll see you next time.